Section 1 of Musings of a Chinese Mystic, Selections from the Philosophy of Chuang Tzu. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Musings of a Chinese Mystic, Selections from the Philosophy of Chuang Tzu by Lionel Giles, translated by Herbert Allen Giles. Introduction, Part 1. Although Chinese history can show no authentic contemporary record prior to the Zhou dynasty, some 1100 years before Christ, there is no doubt that a high pitch of civilization was attained at a much earlier period. Thus, Lao Tzu was in no sense the first humanizing instructor of a semi-barbaric race. On the contrary, his was a reactionary influence, for the cry he raised was directed against the multiplication of laws and restrictions, the growth of luxury, and the other evils which attend rapid material progress. That his lifetime should have coincided with a remarkable extension of the very principles he combated with such energy is one of the ironies of fate. Before he was in his grave, another great man had arisen who laid unexampled stress on the minute regulation of ceremonies and ritual, and succeeded in investing the rules of outward conduct with an importance they had never hitherto possessed. If Lao Tzu, then, had revolted against the growing artificiality of life in his day, a return to nature must have seemed doubly imperative to his disciple, Chuang Tzu, who flourished more than a couple of centuries later, when the bugbear of civilization had steadily advanced. With chagrin, he saw that Lao Tzu's teaching had never obtained any firm hold on the masses, still less on the rulers of China, whereas the star of Confucius was unmistakably in the ascendant. Within his own recollection, the propagation of Confucian ethics had received a powerful impetus from Mencius, the second of China's orthodox sages. Now Chuang Tzu was imbued to the core with the principles of pure Taoism, as handed down by Lao Tzu. He might more fitly be dubbed the Tao-saturated man than Spinoza the God-intoxicated. Tao in its various phases pervaded his inmost being and was reflected in all his thought. He was therefore eminently qualified to revive his master's ringing protest against the materialistic tendencies of the time. Chuang Tzu's worldly position was not high. We learn from Sima Qian that he had a petty official post in a small provincial town, but his literary and philosophical talent must soon have brought him into repute, for we find him in frequent contact with the leading scholars of the age, against whom he is said to have defended his tenets with success. It does not appear, however, that he gained promotion in the public service, which is doubtless to be attributed to his own lack of ambition and shrinking from an active career, as we have his personal account of a deputation which vainly tried to induce him to accept the post of prime minister in the Chu state. Official routine must have proved in the highest degree distasteful to this finely tempered poetic spirit, as it has to many a chafing genius since. Bold in fancy, yet retiring by disposition, prone to melancholy, yet full of eager enthusiasm, a natural skeptic, yet inspired with boundless belief in his doctrine, he was a man full of contradictions, but nonetheless fitted to make a breach in the cast-iron traditions of Confucianism, if not to draw others after him in the same track. Of his mental development there remains no record. His convictions, as they stand revealed in his great philosophical work, are already mature, if somewhat lacking in consistency. He comes before the public as a keen adherent of the school of Lao Tzu, giving eloquent and impassioned utterance to the ideas which had germinated in the brain of his master. Chuang Tzu indeed supplies the primary deficiency of Lao Tzu. He has the gift of language, which enables him to clothe in rich apparel the great thoughts that had hitherto found their only expression in bare disconnected sayings. These scraps of concise wisdom, which are gathered together in the patchwork treatise known as the Tao Te Ching, seems to have formed the kernel of his doctrine, and he proceeded to develop them in 100 different directions. It would be unjust, however, to infer from this that There is nothing in Chuang Tzu which cannot be traced back to the older sage, or that he was incapable of original thought of distinct and independent value. On the contrary, his mental grasp of elusive metaphysical problems was hardly, if at all, inferior to that of Lao Tzu himself, and certainly never equaled by any subsequent Chinese thinker. His writings also have that stimulating suggestiveness which stamps the product of all great minds. After reading and rereading Chuang Tzu, one feels there are latent depths still unplumbed. Moreover, he gives free rein to his own particular fancies and predilections. There are sides of Lao Tzu's teaching at which he hardly glances, or which he passes over entirely, while in other directions he allows his brilliant imagination to carry him far out of sight of his fountainhead. If the analogy be not too heavily pressed, we may say that he was to the founder of Taoism what St. Paul was to the founder of Christianity. As with Lao Tzu, Tao forms the center and pivot of Chuang Tzu's whole system, and this imparts real unity to his work, which in other respects appears undeniably straggling and ill-compacted. But Tao as conceived by Chuang Tzu is not quite the same thing as the Tao of which Lao Tzu spoke with such wondering awe. The difference will be better understood after a brief sketch of the gradual development in the meaning of the word. The first meaning of Tao is road or way, and in very early times it was used by a figure of speech for the way or method of doing a thing. Thus it came to denote a rule of right conduct, moral action, or the principle underlying it. There also grew up in common speech a natural antithesis between the way of heaven, Tian Dao, and the way of man, the former expression signifying the highest standard of wisdom and moral excellence, as opposed to the blind groping after truth here below. Finally, the Dian was dropped, and Tao stood alone for the great unseen principle of good dominating and permeating the universe. The transition is visible in Lao Tzu, who was probably the first to employ the term in its transcendental sense, but who also retains the older expression Tian Dao. In one of his sayings, Tian Dao is practically equivalent to the Tao, the first cause, and must therefore be translated not the way, but the Tao of heaven. This brings us to the next stage, of which Chuang Tzu is a representative. In his writings, Tao never seems to mean way, but he introduces a new element of perplexity by speaking of Tien and Tao as though they were two coexistent, yet perfectly distinct cosmic principles. He also uses the combination Tien Tao, and it is here that the clue to the difficulty must be sought. The Tao of heaven is evidently an attribute rather than a thing in itself, and it is Tien which has now become the first cause. It is a less impersonal conception, however, than Lao Tzu's transcendental Tao, and in fact closely approximates to our own term, God. What then is Chuang Tzu's Tao? Though by no means always clear and consistent on the subject, he seems to regard it as the virtue or manifestation of the divine first principle. It is what he somewhere calls the happiness of God, which to the Taoist, of course, means a state of profound and passionless tranquility, a sacred, everlasting calm. Now, Lao Tzu speaks of Tao as having existed before heaven and earth. Heaven, he says, takes its law from Tao, but the law of Tao is its own spontaneity. With him, therefore, Tao is the antecedent of Tien, being what modern philosophers term the unconditioned or the absolute. As to his Tien, the ambiguity which lurks therein makes it doubtful whether he had any definite conception of it at all. He simply appears to have accepted the already existing Chinese cosmogony, oblivious or careless of its incompatibility with his own novel conception of Tao. Chuang Tzu, to some extent, removes his ambiguity by reverting to the older usage. He deposes Tao from its premier position as the absolute and puts Tien in its place. Tao becomes a mystic moral principle, not unlike Lao Tzu's De, or virtue, and the latter term, when used at all, has lost most of its technical significance. Thus, broadly stated, Some such explanation will prove helpful to the reader, though he may still be baffled by a passage like the following. A man looks upon God as upon his Father, and loves him in like measure. Shall he then not love that which is greater than God? The truth is that neither consistency of thought nor exact terminology can be looked for in Chinese philosophy as a whole, and least of all, perhaps, in such an abstract system as that of early Taoism. Leaving this somewhat barren discussion as to the relative position of Tao and Tien, we now come to what was undoubtedly Chuang Tzu's greatest achievement in the region of pure thought. As in so many other cases, the germ is provided by Lao Tzu, who has the saying, "The recognition of beauty as such implies the idea of ugliness, and the recognition of good implies the idea of evil." Following up this hint, Chuang Tzu is led to insist on the ultimate relativity of all human perceptions. Even space and time are relative. Sense knowledge is gained by looking at things from only one point of view, and is therefore utterly illusory and untrustworthy. Hence, it appears that the most fundamental distinctions of our thought are unreal and crumble away when exposed to the light of nature. Contraries no longer stand in sharp antagonism, but are in some sense actually identical with each other because there is a real and all-embracing unity behind them. There is nothing which is not objective, nothing which is not subjective, which is as much to say that subjective is also objective, and objective also subjective. When he pauses here to ask whether it be possible to say that subjective and objective really exist at all, he seems to be touching the fringe of skepticism, pure and simple. But the point is not pressed. He's an idealist at heart and will not seriously question the existence of a permanent reality underlying the flow of phenomena. True wisdom, then, consists in withdrawing from one's own individual standpoint and entering into subjective relation with all things. He who can achieve this will reject all distinctions of this and that, because he is able to descry an ultimate unity in which they are merged, a mysterious one which blends, transcends them all. Still keeping Lao Tzu in sight, our author draws further curious inferences from this doctrine of relativity. Virtue implies vice, and therefore will indirectly be productive of it. In any case, to aim at being virtuous is only an ignorant and one-sided way of regarding the principles of the universe. Rather, let us transcend the artificial distinctions of right and wrong, and take Tao itself as our model, keeping our minds in a state of perfect balance, absolutely passive and quiescent, making no effort in any direction. The ideal, then, is something which is neither good nor bad, pleasure nor pain, wisdom nor folly. It simply consists in following nature, or taking the line of least resistance. The attainment of this state and the spiritual blessings accruing therefrom constitute the main theme of Chuang Tzu's discourse. His whole duty of man is thus summed up and put into a nutshell. Resolve your mental energy into abstraction, your physical energy into inaction. Allow yourself to fall in with the natural order of phenomena, without admitting the element of self. This elimination of self is in truth the substitution of the ampler atmosphere of Tao for one's own narrow individuality. But Tao is not only inert and unchanging, it is also profoundly unconscious, a strange attribute which at once fixes a gulf between it and our idea of a personal God. And accordingly, since Tao is the grand model for mankind, Chuang Tzu would have us strive to attain, so far as may be, to a like unconsciousness. But absolute and unbroken unconsciousness during this life being an impossibility, he advocates not universal suicide, which would plainly violate the order of nature, but a state of mental abstraction, which shall involve at least a total absence of self-consciousness. In order to explain his thought more clearly, he gives a number of vivid illustrations from life, such as the parable of Prince Hui's cook, who devoted himself to Tao and worked with his mind and not with his eye. He shows that the highest pitch of manual dexterity is attained only by those whose art has become their second nature, who have grown so familiar with their work that all their movements seem to come instinctively and of themselves, who, in other words, have reached the stage at which they are really unconscious of any effort. This application of Tao in the humble sphere of the handicraftsman serves to point the way toward the higher regions of abstract contemplation, where it will find its fullest scope. The same idea is carried into the domain of ethics. As we have seen, Chuang Tzu would have men neither moral nor immoral, but simply non-moral. And to this end, every taint of self-consciousness must be purged away. The mind must be freed from its own criteria, and all one's trust must be placed in natural intuition. Any attempt to impose fixed standards of morality on the peoples of the earth is to be condemned, because it leaves no room for that spontaneous and unforced accord with nature which is the very salt of human action. Thus, were it feasible, Chuang Tzu would transport mankind back to the golden age which existed before the distinction between right and wrong arose. When the artificial barrier between contraries was set up, the world had already, in his eyes, lost its primitive goodness. For the mere fact of being able to call one's conduct good implies a lapse into the uncertain sea of relativity and consequent deviation from the heavenly pattern. Herein lies the explanation of the paradox, on which he is constantly harping, that wisdom, charity, duty to one's neighbor, and so on, are opposed to Tao. It is small wonder that China has hesitated to adopt a system which logically leads to such extreme conclusions. Nevertheless, we must not too hastily write Chuang Tzu off as an unpractical dreamer. Remote though his speculations seem from the world of reality, they rest on a substratum of truth. In order to set forth his views with more startling effect, he certainly laid undue stress on the mystical side of Lao Tzu's philosophy, to the exclusion of much that was better worth handling. That he himself, however, was not altogether blind to the untenability of an extreme position may be gathered from a remark which he casually lets fall. While there should be no action, there should be also no inaction. This is a pregnant saying which shows how Chuang Tzu may have modified his stubborn attitude to meet the necessities of actual life. What he means is that any hard and fast, predetermined line of conduct is to be avoided, abstinence from action just as much as action itself. The great thing is that nothing be done of set purpose when it seems to violate the natural order of events. On the other hand, if a certain course of action presents itself as the most obvious and natural to adopt, it would not be in accordance with Tao to shrink from it. This is known as the doctrine of inaction, but it would be more correctly named the doctrine of spontaneity. There is another noteworthy element in Chuang Tzu's system which does much to smooth away the difficulty in reconciling theory and practice. This is what he calls the doctrine of non-angularity and self-adaptation to externals. It is really a corollary to the grand principle of getting outside one's personality, a process which extends the mental horizon and creates sympathy with the minds of others. Some such wholesome corrective was necessary to prevent the Taoist code from drifting into mere quixotry. Here again Lao Tzu may have supplied the seed which was to ripen in the pages of his disciple. What the world reverences cannot be treated with disrespect, is the dictum of the older sage. But Chuang Tzu went beyond this negative precept. He saw well enough that unless a man is prepared to run his head against a stone wall, he must, in the modern cant phrase, adjust himself to his environment. Without abating a jot of his inmost convictions, he must swim with the tide, so as not to offend others. Outwardly, he may adapt himself if, inwardly he keeps up to his own standard. There must be no raging and tearing propaganda, but infinite patience and tact. Gentle moral suasion and personal example are the only methods that Chuang Tzu will countenance, and even with these he urges caution. If you are always offending others by your superiority, you will probably come to grief. Above all, he abhors the clumsy stupidity which would go on forcing its stock remedies down the people's throat irrespective of place or season. Thus, even Confucius is blamed for trying to revive the dead ashes of the past and make the customs of Chao succeed in Lu. This, he says, is like pushing a boat on land, great trouble and no result, except certain injury to oneself. There must be no blind and rigid adherence to custom and tradition, no unreasoning worship of antiquity. Dress up a monkey in the robes of Chou Kang, and it will not be happy until they are torn to shreds. And the difference between past and present, he adds bitterly, is much the same as the difference between Chou Kang and the monkey. The rebuke conveyed in these remarks is not wholly unmerited. Chuang Tzu, while hardly yielding to Confucius himself in his ardent admiration of the olden time, never fell into the mistake of supposing that the world can stand still, though he feared it might sometimes go backward. He believed that to be the wisest statecraft, which could take account of changed conditions and suit its measures to the age. Plainly, the inactivity he preached, hard though it be to fathom and harder still to compass, was something very different from stagnation. It was a lesson China needed. Well for her in these latter days if she had taken it more to heart. End of section 1.